Hey, maybe today was your best day, or your worst. But if you're here, it means your mind just won't stop moving. Mine doesn't either. So for now, forget the noise, drown the outside world, kill the lights, and drift into this moment with me while the rest of mankind slumbers. Some stories don't live in daylight, they wait for nights like this when the world is finally quiet enough to listen. This is history for the restless mind. Let's travel far away together. Before we fully retreat into the centuries, I am curious. If your eyes are still open, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Has the moon already claimed your sky? Leave a quiet word in the comments and then settle in. Part 1. The Sanctuary of Fear, the Logic of the Lagoon. Tonight, we begin at the end of the world. Not the end of time, but the end of the land. Imagine a shoreline that is not a boundary, but a place of dissolution. The 5th century of our common era. The Roman road has crumbled, the legions are gone, and a new kind of terror, cold and efficient, sweeps down from the north. The Huns, the Lombards, the Goths, all the shadows of a collapsing empire that had once promised order. The people fled. They were not great warriors, but farmers, fishermen, and families carrying only what they could lift. They looked across the Adriatic and they saw a featureless waste, a great shallow grey lagoon, a world of tidal mud and brine where the only constant was the wind. They chose this chaotic, impossible landscape not out of bravery, but out of absolute desperation. The mainland was a battlefield. The water, they hoped, would be a barrier. The challenge of Venice was this: how do you build a city in a place where the tide is always whispering a promise to take it all back? The answer was a colossal, hidden, silent act of faith. They had to create land where there was only water, and they did it with wood. They drove millions upon millions of thick, tightly packed wooden piles, oak, larch, alder, down through the silt and the clay until the point of the trunk found the hard, firm Coranto layer beneath. They created an underwater forest, an inverted support system of unfathomable scale. Imagine the sound of the early settlement. Not the clash of swords or the shout of the forum, but the dull, rhythmic thud of the pile drivers. Day after day, year after year, the sound of human determination pushing against the will of the water. They covered these wooden platforms with stone, carefully binding the brick and marble into the firm foundation. This immense hidden wooden structure never rots. Why? Because it is always fully submerged. The water, which was their greatest threat, became their greatest protector, sealing the wood from the oxygen that brings decay. The Venetians learned the first crucial lesson of their republic. To survive, you must negotiate with nature, not conquer it. The lagoon itself became their first, most formidable defense. It was a treacherous maze of shifting mudbanks, hidden channels, and suddenly shallow waters. Any invading fleet, heavy with troops and armour, would find itself instantly bogged down, its great, deep-drafted ships helpless, listing targets for the nimble, flat-bottomed Venetian boats. The Venetians knew the water's every secret. The outsider knew only its deceptive monotony. From this deep, pragmatic wisdom, a new perspective was born. The Venetians never looked inward, toward the broken kingdoms of Italy. Their gaze was always horizontal, fixed on the line where the sea met the sky. Their livelihood was the salt scraped from the marshes, the most precious commodity of the ancient world. Their future was not in farming fields, but in sailing the waves. They were a society built on fear, but defined by trade. Their freedom was their commerce. Their independence was their ability to float. They became people of the sea, and in doing so, they found a unique, singular identity that no mainland empire could ever truly touch. Listen now to the silence between the waves. It is the sound of a 1,000-year republic being born of mud and defiance. Part 2. The Master of Tides, Engineering the Impossible City. The sheer audacity of building a city of stone on the backs of a drowned forest demanded an unprecedented level of collective discipline and engineering genius. Venice was not an organic growth. It was a single, sustained, and obsessive feat of urban planning. To maintain the illusion of land, the early Venetians had to manage two essential problems: the constant threat of fire and the constant movement of water. First, fire. In a city built on wood, packed tightly into narrow walkways, fire was the apocalypse. The solution was the deliberate fragmentation of the city. Venice is not one island, but 118 small islands linked by over 400 bridges. Each block, separated by a canal, could be isolated if a fire broke out, containing the destruction. The narrow winding calli, the streets, were designed not for carts, which were impossible anyway, but to inhibit the spread of flames and to channel the perpetual wind, acting as fire breaks. The silence and the strange, disorienting geometry of Venice are direct results of this fear of fire. Second, water. The water had to be kept clean, circulating, and deep enough for the ships, but shallow enough to maintain the mud-bar defences. The Venetians undertook a massive long-term civic project to divert the mainland rivers, the Brenta and the Piave, away from the central lagoon. Why? Because the freshwater rivers carried silt, which would slowly, inevitably, turn the lagoon into dry land, destroying their naval defences. This enormous hydraulic work was a project of centuries, a testament to the Venetian belief that the city must always prioritise its relationship with the water. Imagine the sound of the tides, the acqua alta, the high water. It was not seen as a disaster but as a condition of life. The rhythmic rise and fall of the water became the city's clock, its pulse. The ground floors of the grand palaces, the palazzi, were often used as massive storage warehouses, the magazzini, designed to handle occasional flooding. Life was lived on the piano nobile, the noble floor, one story above the water's domain. Even the simple act of walking was transformed. The Venetians developed the bridge as an art form. Every bridge, or ponte, was built without steps initially, designed for easy passage of horses and carts, until they realised the danger of horses slipping on the whetstone and began to remove them. The constant foot traffic, the need to cross over water continually, created a communal, close-knit, and constantly moving society. The very act of navigating Venice forces a meditative pace. You cannot rush the city. You must move at the speed of the canal. This masterful, centuries-long engineering project gave the Venetians a fierce, organised pride. They were not merely living on islands. They were the guardians of an aquatic fortress, the master strategists of the tidal ebb and flow. This mastery allowed them to focus on the one thing that would make them rich: controlling the ships. Part 3. The heart of the empire, the unseen Arsenale. The military and commercial might of Venice did not lie in its army, but in its unparalleled navy. The nerve centre of this power was the Arsenale, the great state-owned shipyard. It was the absolute beating heart of the Republic's economic and defensive machine. The Arsenale was a city shrouded in purposeful secrecy, guarded by high walls and the lions of Piraeus, stolen Greek statues, symbols of power. Foreigners were strictly forbidden from entering. The few who saw it described it with awe and a touch of fear. This was the birthplace of modern mass production. The Venetians applied a sophisticated industrial logic centuries before its time. Rather than building a ship piece by piece, they developed a revolutionary assembly line. The hull of the galley would be floated down a canal, and as it passed each station, from the mast shop to the armory to the food storage, a prefabricated component would be dropped into place. Imagine the terrifying efficiency. It was said, famously, that the Venetians could launch a fully armed warship from a standing start in a matter of hours. A warship ready to sail, complete with crew, biscuit, and cannons. Listen to the sounds that define this hidden city, the relentless squeal of saws, the thud of axes, the deep, rich smell of pine tar and boiling pitch. The pitch was used to seal the thousands of seams in the wooden hull, making it watertight. The air hung heavy with the scent of industry and brine, a smell of immense organized power. The ships they built, the Venetian galleys, were masterpieces of engineering and diplomacy. They were dual-purpose, designed to be massive cargo haulers during peacetime, capable of carrying incredible amounts of silk and spice, and instantly convertible to sleek, lightning-fast warships in times of conflict. This flexibility was the key to their commercial dominance. The state owned the dockyards, controlled the quality of the timber, and ensured the standardization of parts. The Venetians understood that quality control and supply chain management were more vital than gold mines. Every part of the ship was interchangeable, allowing for rapid repairs in distant ports, a logistical marvel that no competitor could match. The Arsenale was more than a shipyard. It was a statement. It confirmed the Republic's unyielding commitment to naval supremacy. It was the physical manifestation of the Doge's annual declaration to the sea. They did not merely wed the water, they were its technological masters, capable of breeding a new navy on demand, faster than any enemy could sail against them. It was a secret, silent, and formidable economic weapon. Part 4. The marriage ceremony. The business of faith. Every year, the Doge performed the most important civic ceremony, the sposalizio del mar, the marriage to the sea. This was a spectacle of political theatre, a declaration of intent, and a public reaffirmation of Venice's unique identity. On the Feast of the Ascension, the Doge would board the Bucintoro, the state barge. It was not a practical ship. It was pure, floating, gilded propaganda, painted in lavish red and gold, covered in mythological carvings, and rowed by 168 oarsmen. The Bucintoro was designed to reflect the sheer, impossible wealth of the Republic. It was the moving throne of the world's most powerful merchant. The barge would sail out into the open Adriatic, surrounded by 1,000 small boats carrying the patricians and the common citizens. When they reached the Porto di Lido, the opening to the open sea, the Doge would rise. He would take a consecrated golden ring, a precious, eternal circle, and cast it into the water with the quiet, firm declaration, Desponsamus te, mare, in signum veri perpetuique domini. We wed thee, O sea, in token of true and everlasting dominion. This ritual was a deliberate and strategic blending of faith and commerce. It declared that Venice's sovereignty was divine, eternal, and non-negotiable. The city claimed the Adriatic not by conquest of armies, but by the will of God, sealed by a golden contract. It made every Venetian a stakeholder in the sea's fortune. The ceremony cemented their identity as a thalassocracy, a government by the sea. They were not bound by the feudal loyalties of the mainland. They owed no allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, and they were fiercely independent of the Pope. Their highest loyalty was to the Republic, and the Republic's highest loyalty was to its commerce. This marriage was not romantic, it was intensely practical. It meant that Venice would fight any power, Christian or Muslim, East or West, that threatened the freedom of the Adriatic or the safety of its trade routes. The Venetians were ruthless pragmatists. They funded crusades when it served their trading interests, and they traded peacefully with the Ottoman Turks when it served their economy. Their god was the one who blessed their ships and guaranteed their profits. This dual identity, the sacred ceremony and the brutal commercial reality, is the key to the Venetian psyche. They could be profoundly religious, build in magnificent churches to ward off the plague, yet equally capable of cold-blooded commercial decisions such as the infamous diversion of the Fourth Crusade to sack the Christian city of Zara, and later, their own benefactor, Constantinople, to secure their trading dominance. The water was their greatest love, their source of wealth, and their final permanent boundary. The ring, now lost in the depths, symbolized a bond unbreakable by men or armies. Part 5. The global artery. The spice and the silk, Venice became rich on a single powerful principle: monopoly of scarcity. They controlled access to the exotic necessities of the medieval and Renaissance worlds. The most potent commodity was spice. Imagine the flavour of medieval Europe, bland and monotonous. Then imagine the arrival of a Venetian ship, carrying the intense dark heat of black pepper, the subtle warming power of cinnamon, or the psychoactive, mind-dulling beauty of nutmeg and cloves. Spices were not merely flavourings, they were medicines, aphrodisiacs, preservatives, and status symbols. They were worth more than their weight in silver. Venice controlled the chain. Spices flowed from India, via the Red Sea, through Mamluk Egypt, and then into the Venetian warehouses. They negotiated the most favourable contracts, paid in Venetian gold ducats, the world's most stable currency, and then controlled the distribution across Europe. Every king, every noble, every wealthy merchant in London or Paris was financially dependent on a small muddy island chain in the Adriatic. The trade was not limited to flavour. They brought silk, woven with the deep colours of the East, transforming European fashion. They brought glass, perfected in the secluded workshops of Murano, so bright and clear it seemed to defy nature. They brought alum, a mineral crucial for dyeing cloth. And they brought knowledge. Venetian merchants were the original intelligence agents. Men like Marco Polo were not merely travellers, they were information brokers for the state. Every report of a distant land, every rumour of a new emperor, every detail about a foreign port's fortifications was immediately channeled back to the Council of Ten. They knew the world better than any other state because they had turned their trade network into a global listening post. This vast commerce demanded a financial system of equal sophistication. The city invented many of the tools of modern capitalism. Double-entry bookkeeping, allowing merchants to track the precise health of their complex ventures. The bank, or banco, where merchants sat at benches in the Rialto. The concept of transferable credit, reducing the need to carry huge amounts of physical gold. Marine insurance, distributing the risk of loss across multiple investors. The Rialto Bridge, which we see now as a tourist attraction, was the original Wall Street. It was here, in the dim, chaotic light of the market stalls, that fortunes were made and lost with a whisper, sealed with a quiet nod and the simple confidence in the stability of the Venetian ducat. The city was a perpetual soundscape of the world's commerce, the cacophony of 1,000 languages, Arabic, Greek, Turkish, German, French, all swirling together. The deep groan of the unloading cargo ships, the sharp metallic ring of the ducats changing hands. It was the sound of money, beautiful and relentlessly practical. And it was all happening on an island built of wood, entirely dependent on a sea they had promised to master forever. Part 6. The oligarchy's gaze, the silence of power. To protect this immense precarious wealth, the Venetian political system had to be impenetrable and ruthless. It was a republic, yes, but only for the approximately 200 noble families whose names were inscribed in the Golden Book, Libro d'Oro. After the serrata, or closing of the Great Council in 1297, the gates of power were welded shut. The Doge became the symbol, but the hidden engine was the network of councils. The real power was held by the Council of Ten, and later, the fearsome inquisitors of state. Their goal was simple: to ensure the security, stability, and absolute non-changeability of the state. They were the architects of institutional paranoia. Imagine a government that trusts no one, especially not its own leaders. The Doge himself was surveilled, his correspondence opened, and his power carefully clipped. He was not a king, he was the Republic's first servant, constrained by complex laws and judged severely if he failed. The Council of Ten preferred to operate in utter silence. They did not shout, they did not hold public rallies. Their greatest weapon was the sense of omnipresent surveillance. Every action was recorded. Every conversation might be heard. This atmosphere of controlled fear created a society of intense discipline, where everyone understood the unspoken rule. You can be as rich, as luxurious, and as private as you like, as long as you never interfere with the affairs of the state. The palace, the magnificent Doge's palace, was a beautiful trap. It housed the state's official face, but hidden within its marble walls were the instruments of its power, the pozzi and the piombi. The pozzi, the wells, were the prisons at the water level. Cold, damp, and often below the high tide mark, they were psychological horrors designed to break the will with constant chilling moisture. The piombi, the leads, were the cells directly beneath the palace's lead roof. In summer, they baked the prisoners in an unbearable heat. In winter, they offered a crushing silent cold. They were the physical embodiment of the state's absolute inescapable control. The most famous architectural feature of the palace is the Bridge of Sighs, Ponte dei Sospiri. It was the enclosed walkway connecting the interrogation rooms of the Doge's palace to the new prisons across the canal. It is often romanticised, but its original purpose was grim. It was the final walk of a condemned man, giving him one last brief obscured view of the outside world before his long silence began. The sigh was one of profound loss. This political system, built on surveillance, secrecy, and the silent threat of the Pozzi and Piombi, allowed the Venetian aristocracy to maintain control for a millennium. They understood that order is not achieved through love, but through the calm, predictable application of power. The stillness of the canals outside the palace walls was a reflection of the deep, institutional silence within. Part 7. The Aesthetics of Wealth, the Drama of Light and Silk. The wealth that flowed into Venice from the east fueled an artistic and architectural revolution dedicated not to sacred theology, but to the display of earthly glory. Venetian art is the art of commerce, luxury, and the beauty of the material world. Unlike Florentine art, which was concerned with the perfect line and idealized form, Venetian art was dominated by color. The deep, intoxicating colors derived from the imported pigments of the East. The art of Titian, Veronese, and Tintoretto is a masterclass in the drama of light falling on texture, the deep, shimmering folds of imported silk, the rich, living color of velvet, the pale, reflective skin of the city's wealthy, confident citizens. Their subjects were vast, sprawling narrative scenes. Their compositions were often off-balance, dynamic, and full of intense emotional energy. A perfect mirror for the city's complex, dramatic life. They didn't just paint stories, they painted atmosphere. The city's wealth was also channeled into magnificent public architecture, often in the form of scuole grandi, secular confraternities that became centers of charity, communal identity, and immense artistic patronage. The Scuola Grande di San Rocco, filled with the canvases of Tintoretto, is a dark, overwhelming space designed to envelop the visitor in a sense of overwhelming spiritual power, funded entirely by merchant wealth. The most important architectural feature of the city, however, remains the great churches built in devotion after the devastating plagues. The most beautiful, the Santa Maria della Salute, was built as a monumental offering to the Virgin Mary for deliverance from the disease that killed thousands. Its great dome is a crown on the city's skyline, an acknowledgement that even the master of the sea was ultimately reliant on a higher power for its survival. The Venetian aesthetic, therefore, is one of glorious, unapologetic materialism tempered by a profound, practical spirituality. The beauty of a Titian painting is not in its saintliness, but in the shimmering reality of the silk the saint is wearing. The architecture is not merely beautiful. It is a contract, a promise made to God in exchange for stability. The Venetians were collectors of the sacred. They raided Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade and brought back relics of enormous symbolic power. The body of Saint Mark, smuggled from Alexandria in a barrel of pork to deter Muslim inspectors, and the 4 great bronze horses from the Hippodrome. These were not just trophies, they were powerful talismans, symbols that Venice was now the rightful inheritor of the mantle of Rome and Byzantium. They created a history for themselves by collecting the most potent fragments of the past. Part 8. The Release of Discipline, the Mask and the Vice. The immense pressure of the secret, disciplined Venetian system required an equally immense release. This release was the Carnival, a season of controlled, state-sanctioned chaos. The Carnival in Venice was more than a party. It was a psychological and political safety valve. For weeks, the city dissolved its own rigid social contract. The primary tool of this dissolution was the mask. The most famous mask was the borta, a white featureless mask with a sharp chin that hid the wearer's identity but did not obscure their voice. The moretta, a small black velvet mask, was held in place by biting a button between the teeth, rendering the wearer beautifully silent. The mask was freedom. It allowed the poor to mock the noble to engage in clandestine trade, and the wife to meet her lover without fear of the council's silent gaze. It created an atmosphere of delicious, shared transgression. The carnival provided the release of pressure necessary for the continuation of the oligarchy. The council understood that if they allowed the people to be free for 2 months a year, they would accept discipline for the other 10. It was a calculated expenditure of chaos. This release also extended into vice. The ridotto, the gambling house, was officially sanctioned and managed by the government. Here the aristocracy, masked and shrouded, gambled immense fortunes, transferring wealth under the cover of the game. It was here that the famous Casanova, a product of this indulgent libertine society, made and lost his money. The state licensed and controlled the vice, ensuring that the excess was contained and, crucially, that the profits flowed back into the hands of the ruling class. The Venice of the 18th century became famous throughout Europe for its decadence and its elegant corruption. Foreign travellers flocked here to experience the freedom of the mask, the thrill of the gambling table, and the unique languid sensuality of a city that had seemingly abandoned its ruthless purpose for the pursuit of sophisticated pleasure. The city had become a jewel of luxury, draped in silk and perpetually masked. But beneath the velvet and the gold, the machine was slowing. The obsession with pleasure was a profound symptom of the deeper structural problem, the loss of purpose. The city was no longer defined by its trade routes. It was defined by its ability to entertain. The mask, once a tool of temporary social freedom, became a permanent feature of the city's fading identity. Venice was simply masking the slow, quiet truth that the tide had turned against it. Part 9. The Slow Poison, the Turning of the World's Map. The collapse of the Venetian Empire was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, decades-long process of economic poisoning. 2 events, separated by centuries, sealed its fate. The first, and most profound, was the Age of Discovery, specifically Vasco da Gama's 1498 voyage, which rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Suddenly, the great, powerful Venetian monopoly on the spice trade was rendered obsolete. The Portuguese could now sail directly to India, bypassing the entire Venetian Mamluk network. The goods still arrived in Venice, but now they were cheaper and faster in Lisbon. The economic axis of the world had tilted away from the Mediterranean and swung violently towards the Atlantic. The sea that Venice had married was no longer the centre of the world's commerce. It was a scenic, profitable backwater. The Venetians fought back fiercely, but they could not fight geography. They tried to fund efforts to cut a Suez Canal. They tried to sabotage the Portuguese trade. But the reality was simple. The Atlantic was the future, and the Mediterranean was the past. The second slow poison was the Ottoman Wars. For centuries, Venice was in constant, brutal naval conflict with the expanding Ottoman Empire. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was a symbolic, epic victory for the Christian powers. But the long, exhausting attrition of the war crippled Venice's naval power and bled its treasury dry. They lost key ports like Cyprus and Crete, chipping away at their trade dominance until they were left clinging only to their home lagoon. This long, grinding decline forced a psychological shift in the Venetian aristocracy. They stopped being ruthless, pioneering merchants who risked everything on a voyage, and began to become rentiers, landlords who invested their remaining wealth in safe, comfortable properties on the mainland. They started building the magnificent villas of the Veneto, retreating from the water that had once been their lifeblood. The merchant who looked outward to the horizon was replaced by the gentleman who looked inward to his garden. The fierce singular will to maintain the Republic's commercial supremacy softened into a weary, expensive indifference. The city was no longer run by traders seeking opportunity, but by tired nobles seeking comfort and pleasure. The mask, once a temporary disguise, became a permanent veil over the eyes of a state that no longer wished to see its own decline. The sea, having been declared their eternal spouse, slowly began to reclaim her dominion. The discipline that had engineered the great river diversions faded. The channels began to silt up. The constant, necessary maintenance of the city's foundations became a financial burden too great for the declining treasury. The city became beautiful, but structurally tired. She was settling into a quiet, protracted sleep. Part X. The Quiet Abdication, the Transformation to Myth. The 1,000-year Venetian Republic died on a cold, quiet day in 1797. It did not die with a bang, but with a whisper, the final, ignominious act of a city that had run out of the will to live. When Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at the lagoon, the mighty Arsenal was silent. The war fleet was mostly gone, and the Council of Ten was paralysed by fear and indecision. The Doge, Ludovico Manin, was a weary, melancholic man. He presided over the final quiet collapse of a millennium of independence. Napoleon didn't have to launch a siege. He simply demanded the keys to the city and the end of the Republic. The Great Council met one last time in the echoing halls of the Doge's palace. Instead of the fierce, disciplined debates of centuries past, there was only silence and the rustling of papers. The council voted to dissolve itself. The Doge, in a final, quiet act of surrender, removed his ceremonial cap and handed it to his servant, uttering the heartbreaking final words, "Tolemo el cappello, non siamo più noi." Let us take off the cap. We are no longer Doge. The symbol of the Republic's power, the golden ring, was not returned to the sea. It was simply lost or stolen. The great winged lion of St. Mark was taken down from the column in the piazza and shipped off to Paris. The Bucintoro, the golden barge of the marriage to the sea, was stripped of its gold, burned for its metal, and reduced to a mere boat. The final act of Napoleon was one of deliberate symbolic annihilation. The end was a profound, shocking silence. A great power that had mastered the seas for 1,000 years ended not in heroic failure, but in political resignation. But the death of the state was the birth of the myth. When Venice stopped being an empire of ruthless commerce, it began its transformation into a jewel of memory. Stripped of its purpose, it became a piece of art, a fragile, enduring monument to human ambition, engineering, and the poetry of water. Tonight, as we conclude our journey, the sound is simple. It is the rhythmic lapping of water against the Istrian stone and the damp stillness of the canals. The voices of the great merchants, the spies of the council, the cries of the Arsenale workers. All are gone. All that remains is a sound of the past. Walk with me now through the empty, low-lit calli. The silence here is not emptiness. It is history breathing. It tells you that the greatest strength of Venice was not its bronze or its gold, but its willingness to defy the land, to marry the sea, and to exist in a permanent state of impossible grace. The empire is gone, but the dream remains. It exists in the shadows of the Doge's palace, in the silent, perpetual motion of the lagoon, and in the sheer, profound beauty of a city built on the memory of fear and the promise of endless water. She has simply gone to sleep, and in her sleep, she finally finds the peace she fought for 1,000 years to achieve. And that's where we'll leave tonight's journey. Somewhere out there, the sun is rising, and somewhere else, it's still deep night. Wherever you are, thank you for keeping me company in the quiet. If you're still awake, tell me. Where in the world are you listening from right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed drifting through the past with me, make sure to follow along for the next one. Until then, rest easy and let your mind wander kindly. This has been History for the Restless Mind. Until we meet again.